George and the Price of Respect. George was a tall, quiet man in his 40s. His clothes were always simple: worn jeans, work boots, and an old flannel shirt. He didn't stand out in a crowd, and no one would turn their head to look at him. But there was a calm confidence in his eyes that few could recognize. One day, George drove to a luxury car dealership. His old pickup truck creaked and groaned as he parked it, the door barely closing behind him. Smiling, he walked inside. "Good afternoon," he said to a salesman. "I'm interested in looking at a new SUV." The salesman, a young man in a sleek suit and shiny watch, looked George up and down, barely hiding his smirk. "Our cars aren't exactly cheap," he said with a condescending smile. "Maybe you'd be better off checking the used lot across the street?" George nodded. "So, you judge by clothes, huh?" The salesman shrugged. "Just trying to save you time." Without another word, George turned and left. A few hours later, a man in a suit walked into the dealership. He was a manager from a local bank. "One of my good friends came here today," he said to the front desk. "Tall guy, jeans, flannel shirt. Name's George Taylor. Do you know who he is?" "No," said the salesman nervously. "He owns 3 lumber mills in this state," said the banker. "His business brings in millions every year. He wanted to buy 3 vehicles, one for himself, his wife, and his son. But you just lost that sale." The salesman went pale and tried calling George, but got no response. The next day, George was featured in the local newspaper. He stood proudly in front of another dealership, signing papers for 3 brand-new cars, wearing a sharp jacket, but the same old flannel shirt underneath. The headline read, "Never judge by appearance. George Taylor reminds the town that respect is priceless." Continued. The following morning, George returned to the new dealership where he had been treated with respect. The staff greeted him with smiles and respect. The manager came out personally. "Mr. Taylor, everything is ready. Here are the keys to all 3 vehicles. We also included a 3-year full-service package, free of charge." George thanked them and handed over a check for a significant amount. He could afford dozens of cars like these, but he valued people and dignity more than luxury. After the purchase, he didn't leave right away. Instead, he drove to the same dealership that had mocked him the day before. He parked his shining new SUV in front of the building and stepped out in a perfectly fitted suit. The same employees noticed him immediately. The young salesman froze. "Remember me?" George asked calmly. Yes. Of course," the salesman stammered. "That's my new SUV," George pointed out the window. "I bought it elsewhere. They didn't judge me by how I looked. Good luck to you. Learn to see people for who they really are." He walked away, leaving behind silence and a heavy realization. The salesman now understood that some things in life cost far more than money, like lost respect. The turnaround. The days passed, and George's story began to circulate on social media. People across the state shared the article with comments like, "This is what humility looks like," and "Never underestimate anyone." The car salesman who had mocked George became the talk of the town, but not in a good way. Customers avoided him, and his manager called him in for a serious conversation. "You didn't just lose a sale," the manager said, looking him dead in the eyes. "You damaged our brand. We're supposed to sell luxury, and luxury starts with respect." Meanwhile, George continued his life as usual. He wasn't interested in the fame or the attention. He donated one of the new SUVs to a local family who had lost their vehicle in a fire. The other 2 cars he kept for his wife and son. One evening, while George was walking through the downtown farmers market, He noticed the young salesman sitting alone on a bench, looking defeated. Their eyes met. George hesitated. Then he walked over and sat next to him. The salesman looked surprised. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I judged you without knowing a thing about you. I was wrong." George nodded, thoughtful. "Most people don't get a second chance to learn that lesson. I hope you do something with it." The salesman looked up. "I will. Thank you." George stood up, smiled slightly, and walked off into the evening crowd. That moment didn't make headlines, but it made a difference. Because respect, when given and received, has a way of turning even the coldest moments into something powerful. Redemption and legacy weeks turned into months. George went back to his usual life, early mornings at the mill, walking the production floor with his sleeves rolled up, sharing coffee with workers, and answering emails late into the night. For all his wealth, George lived simply. He believed in building, not showing off. But the story of his visit to the dealership didn't fade away. It became a case study in business schools, a lesson for young entrepreneurs, and a story told in motivational seminars. As for Ryan, the young salesman, the experience shook him more than he expected. His manager didn't fire him, but gave him a probation period, along with an ultimatum. Change how you treat people or you're out. At first, Ryan struggled. The shame lingered. Customers avoided him, and colleagues whispered. But somewhere deep inside, he knew this was a turning point. So he began to listen. He treated every person who walked through the door with dignity, whether they came in wearing designer suits or work boots. He read books on emotional intelligence, studied successful entrepreneurs, and even started volunteering on weekends at a shelter, just to remind himself what humanity felt like outside of sales quotas. 2 years later, Ryan had completely transformed. He became the top salesman in the dealership, not because of flashy tricks, but because people trusted him. His reputation spread. If you want to be treated right, talk to Ryan. He was promoted to sales manager and began training new employees, starting every session with the same story. "I once laughed at a man in an old shirt. He taught me a lesson I'll never forget." Meanwhile, George quietly noticed the change. One day, he came back to that same dealership, not to buy a car, but to leave something. He walked in, handed an envelope to the receptionist, and left without saying a word. Inside was a letter. "Ryan, I heard you've changed. I wanted to say I'm proud of you. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about growth. You took what could have destroyed your future and turned it into strength. That's rare. Enclosed is a small investment fund. I don't want it back. Use it to start something of your own someday. And if you ever help someone who was overlooked like I was, then we'll call it even." George Taylor inside was a check, a large one. Ryan stared at it for a long time. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed up sketching out ideas for a future business. A small, inclusive dealership where everyone, no matter their background or appearance, would be treated with fairness. A place where employees were trained not just to sell, but to connect. 3 years later, True Drive Motors opened on the edge of town. Its motto, engraved in bold letters over the glass doors, read, "Dignity is our starting price." The grand opening was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked Ryan what inspired it all. He smiled and simply said, "An old flannel shirt, a red pickup truck, and the richest man I ever met." And far back in the crowd, leaning casually against a familiar old truck, George watched with quiet pride. Because sometimes, the most powerful legacies aren't left in money or buildings. but in the people we help become their best.